Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tearing down the noise and looking at the hidden architecture of the climate debate. You know the loud arguments we hear every single day? Well, they're hiding the structural truths. If you've ever felt like we're just spinning our wheels in this public conversation, you're not alone. We're going to peel back the layers and uncover the underlying systems that actually pull the strings. Let's get right into it. So here is our profound mystery. Think about it. Why have 2 solid decades of climate debate totally failed to bend the global emissions curve? I mean, we've had massive global summits, endless wall-to-wall media coverage, and yet the overall trajectory hasn't fundamentally budged. To figure out why, we have to hold our breath and dive way below the surface of all this usual political theater. And that brings us to the ultimate framing collision dominating our culture. On one hand, you have the science is settled. On the exact opposite end, the science is a scam. Now, what is truly fascinating here is that both sides are absolutely convinced that this fight is the whole ballgame. They both claim science as their ultimate authority. But the reality? This public collision is literally just the tip of the iceberg. The science fight is actually just a stand-in for a much deeper structural argument that nobody really wants to have out in the open. Okay, so to understand what's really going on, we first need to strip away the political rhetoric and impartially look at the empirical science. Because the major load-bearing claims here, they do not hang on a single fragile thread. We're talking about converging independent measurements established over literally centuries. Get this, back in 1859, which is older than our modern understanding of the periodic table, by the way, John Tyndall established the greenhouse properties of CO2. Then, in 1896, Svante Arrhenius calculated the temperature effects of doubling that CO2. And by the mid-20th century, atmospheric chemists were using isotope matching to find the exact source of that carbon. This is centuries of foundational physics and chemistry. And you know, the evidence just builds from there. The attribution claim, the idea that recent warming is predominantly caused by human emissions, relies on multiple, totally independent lines of proof. First up, we have satellite measurements that show the exact specific spectral signature of trapped radiation that greenhouse warming predicts. Second, the stratosphere is actually cooling down while the lower atmosphere warms up. This is a crucial detail because it completely eliminates alternative explanations like, say, an increase in solar output, which would just warm everything up evenly. And finally, fossil fuels carry a really distinctive isotopic fingerprint. That means chemists can directly measure the exact proportion of new CO2 in the air that comes specifically from buried hydrocarbons. I actually want to slow down for just a second here to focus on one specific word: unequivocal. That word comes directly from the IPCC's sixth assessment report. Now, massive synthesis bodies that represent thousands of scientists, they do not reach for a word like unequivocal casually. They just don't. It is only ever used when converging evidence has crossed a threshold where alternative natural explanations are simply no longer scientifically tenable. Now, let's flip the script and methodically look at the other side of this framing collision. And again, we're not taking any political sides here, we are purely looking at the empirical, geological, and atmospheric record. The source text actually deconstructs several really popular claims. For instance, take the claim that ice ages happened back when CO2 levels were super high. Well, the missing variable there? The faint young sun. The sun was actually about 6% dimmer 700 million years ago, which is a massive, overwhelming factor that totally cancels out those CO2 differences. Or take the claim that climate models are incorrect. That argument often relies on cherry-picking one unrepresentative, high-warming model run and comparing it to a really short period of natural variability. And what about the idea that humans only contribute 3% of total emissions? Well, that entirely ignores the fact that the natural carbon cycle is perfectly balanced. Our 3% isn't part of that balance. It's the accumulating, unbalanced excess piling up year after year. But there's a really fascinating structural irony at play here. A primary rhetorical instruction you'll often hear from the climate skeptic camp is to follow the money. The implication being that modestly paid climate scientists are just hyping up the issue for grant funding. But if you apply that exact same test symmetrically, the reality is pretty striking. Historically, prominent public skeptics have actually held directorships and received substantial compensation from the mining and fossil fuel sectors. So the camp instructing the public to follow the money often relies on funding bases tied directly to the very industrial interests they're defending. It's a massive irony. So, if the empirical evidence is so robust, why on earth is the public still so fiercely divided? The answer is something called environment tracking. As our explainer text explores through a really interesting case study of a woman named Lucy Biggers, most people out there aren't arguing about the raw scientific literature at all. Let's be real, they haven't read the dense IPCC reports or analyzed carbon isotope ratios. Instead, they're forming their convictions based on their social circles, institutional networks, and tribal affiliations. People adopt the vocabulary of empirical evidence just to match their social environment. When it comes down to it, it's a tribal fight using the words of science. All right, this brings us even deeper underwater. If the whole public fight is mostly about social affiliation, the policy fight just downstream is also totally misaligned. Welcome to Layer 2, the policy trap. Okay, let's dive into this. For the last 15 years, the absolute dominant policy tool championed by experts has been the carbon tax, which relies on Pigouvian taxation theory. It's a 3-step process. Step 1, raise the price of fossil fuel consumption. Step 2, that produces a price signal that suppresses marginal consumption. Step 3, that shifts investment toward lower carbon alternatives. And you know what? In abstract, academic, economic textbooks, this works perfectly. It makes total logical sense to price in negative externalities. But let's look at the real world for a second. When you actually implement this policy, it hits massive structural frictions. We've seen this play out in recent Canadian elections and with the huge French Gilets jaunes protests. The tax has incredibly regressive impacts on working populations who are already dealing with rising monthly costs across the board. And why? Because the alternatives just aren't there yet for everyday people. There's a severe lack of affordable electric vehicles, a total absence of viable public transit in so many regions, and you can't just easily get cheap home heating retrofits. The public isn't rejecting this because of a bad communication strategy. They're rejecting it because it's a very real structural failure in their day-to-day lives. There's a quote from the source material that hits the nail on the head, perfectly illustrating this underlying problem. The carbon tax tries to push the population through a door the architecture has not opened. It's such a brilliant visual, isn't it? A price signal completely and utterly fails when populations lack the physical infrastructure or the capital to actually change their behavior. The signal just arrives as a painful, unavoidable cost with literally no viable exit. Which brings us all the way down to the absolute bedrock of this explainer. The economy itself is not what we typically think it is. We are now at the very bottom of the iceberg, the hidden architecture. $74.5 billion. Just let that massive number sink in for a second. That is the staggering estimate of direct, indirect, and infrastructural subsidies flowing to fossil fuels every single year in Canada alone. According to some really careful accountings, the underlying architecture is so heavily skewed, it is literally subsidizing fossil fuel production with one hand through one set of government ministries, while simultaneously taxing working-class consumption with the other. But wait, here is where the story takes an incredibly dynamic, positive turn. 90%. That is exactly how much the cost of solar photovoltaics has absolutely plummeted since 2010. The underlying technology cost curves are showing us that the energy transition is actually winning on pure, unadulterated economics, completely independent of any carbon pricing apparatus. And the good news doesn't stop there. Onshore wind costs have dropped by roughly 70% over that exact same time frame. Battery storage has followed a similarly massive decline. We've reached a point where the levelized cost of new utility-scale solar and onshore wind is now frequently cheaper than the cost of new fossil fuel generation. Renewable investments are quite literally naturally outpacing fossil fuels globally simply because the raw economics make sense. So here is the absolutely crucial point to take away from all this. Both sides of the loud, messy public climate debate actually share the exact same illusion. They both treat the economy as a neutral background where their policy fights just sort of take place. But the reality? The economy is an active stage, and right now, that stage is fundamentally tilted to favor the incumbents. The architecture itself is the operative variable here. This totally reveals who the real decision makers are. Spoiler alert, it's not the people shouting at each other on social media. The actual real-world energy mix is dictated by central bank prudential regulations, banking sector capital rules, and the lending priorities of sovereign development banks. It's all about credit risk weightings for mature renewables and how fast we can navigate permitting frameworks for grid infrastructure. The real transition is being driven by who gets cheap credit and regulatory permission.
These structural levers completely bypass the loud, surface-level climate debates we're exposed to every single day. So, we arrive at our final thought. The science is largely established, the popular pricing policies have hit a massive structural wall, and the transition is actually happening on the back of pure economics anyway. The real fight isn't about whether the climate is changing. It's about the deeply embedded credit and regulatory systems that still favor old infrastructure. So I leave you with this. Instead of arguing endlessly over surface-level politics, shouldn't we be asking what architecture is actually deciding our energy mix behind the scenes? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this leaves you hungry to uncover the hidden systems shaping our world.